Hey you! Yes, you, watching this video. Do you want to own a piece of Scribbler? Only not a lock of hair or blood or flesh or anything else that will get you in trouble with the law? Well, now you can, with t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags and mugs featuring Obab Scribbler at her Teespring store. You know you want to. I shall now stop talking in third person and send you on to the video. Be lovely to each other and enjoy the show.
When I'm with you, be my silhouette. Come and be my view.
Sweetheart, do you know where I put my umbrella?
Caramel's voice sounded from deep in the closet by the door, his mellow tan hindquarters the only thing visible as he rooted about, his brown tail lashing in mild agitation. Pinkie Pie's chipper voice called out over a faint clattering from the direction of the kitchen.
You left it hanging on the coat pegs by the back door!
The earth pony stallion backed out of the closet and trotted across the empty tile floor of Sugar Cube Corner and disappeared through a swinging door marked Employees Only. A couple of moments later, his plaintive call came from the storeroom.
Now where did I leave my rain slicker? It was just here yesterday.
Pinkie's voice in the kitchen chirped in reply.
On the rack in the bathroom, remember? From when Snails brought Gummy over from Froggy and Bob for his weekly bath?
Oh, right. How could I forget?
Came the stallion's mildly pained reply as he cantered out of the back room, shaking his head, an umbrella hanging by its hook from his withers. He made his way around one of the side counters and up the stairs. Pinkie replied with a giggle over the sound of pots and bowls being moved around.
The same way you always forget things, silly. It's like your special talent or something. I'd certainly never forget wrestling a 32-hoop-long alligator all the way up the back steps and into the bathtub. Especially since we do it every week. That's some impressive forgetting right there. Oh, you know what? I bet that's why you only have 3 Hutches on the cutie mark instead of 4.
Caramel let out a sigh as he came trotting down the stairs, a shiny green rain slicker draped over his back along with the umbrella.
I remember Gummy's bath time, sweetheart.
He quietly suppressed a shudder while casting about at the bottom of the stairs.
Now I don't remember where I left my galoshes.
Pinkie's voice took on an apologetic tone.
You left them on the back porch. They're probably just filled to the brim with water right now, which totally defeats the whole point of a galosh, doesn't it? Why didn't you wear mine? They're in the front closet.
The tan stallion walked back to the closet and craned his neck inside, coming back out with a quartet of boots in his mouth made of almost fluorescent magenta rubber. He set them down and cocked his head dubiously as he looked at them.
I don't know, sweetheart. I don't think they, fit me.
Another giggle came from the kitchen.
Just loosen the straps, Gumdrop. They'll stretch.
The stallion pursed his lips and let out a sigh of imminent defeat.
But they're pink.
At this, the door to the kitchen swung open, and a slightly pouting cotton candy-coloured face dusted with sugar and flour poked out and fixed him with a pair of limpid blue eyes that narrowed indignantly.
Hey, what's wrong with Pink?
Caramel hung his head with a soft chuckle and trotted over to his fiancée's side, nuzzling her gently behind the ear, which caused the tiny gem-studded horseshoes on her engagement earring to twinkle in the light.
Nothing at all, sugar. It just doesn't look as good on me as it does on a certain mare I know.
Pinkie Pie gave a little hop and turned her head so she was nose to nose with the tan stallion.
Ooh, you know I love guessing games. Is it Twilight Sparkle? She's got that super neat pink stripe in her mane and tail.
Caramel's face fell for a moment as his train of thought derailed, but with an ease born of hard practice, he switched tracks. He gave her a weary smile and a peck on the nose, and then walked back to the galoshes, settling down to loosen the straps and push his hooves into them.
No. I'll give you a hint, sweetheart. She's the only pony I'd be willing to go out in this downpour for, especially wearing a set of bright pink booties.
She tapped her chin with a hoof as she turned back toward the kitchen.
Fluttershy?
Caramel breathed out another sigh as he got back to his feet.
Close, but no.
Now fully, if slightly ridiculously, girded against the lashing rain that pattered against the shop's window outside, he followed her as she made her way to the centre island, where a large mixing bowl, a bag of flour, and a flour sifter waited. On one corner was a white cardboard pastry box wrapped in pink cling wrap and neatly tied off with string. Pinkie picked up the flour in her forehooves and dumped a measure of it into the sifter, as Caramel took hold of the box's strings in his teeth and craned his neck to place it on his shoulders. Then he shifted the cape of the rain slicker so it was better protected. When he turned back to face her, he gave her a sly grin.
I'll give you one more hint, Sugar. She's the all-over pinkest, sweetest, most beautiful mare this side of Equestria.
Her blue eyes crossed slightly in what passed for pensiveness for her.
Berry Punch?
Caramel's face settled into a befuddled expression that was all too common for him.
No, she's more purple.
Cheerily?
She's what I'd call a mauve, I guess. And still no.
Diamond Tiara?
What? No way. Well, okay, she's pink, but she's definitely not who I'm talking about.
Princess Celestia?
The tan stallion furrowed his brows with the usual sinking feeling that the conversation was about to buck him off.
Princess Celestia isn't pink.
I know, right? But try telling that to Husband.
She stopped and gave a little hop.
Oh, is it Lotus?
Her face took on a puzzled expression.
Oh wait, Aloe. I can never tell which twin is the pink one.
Caramel blinked several times before he shook his head.
You know, now that you mention it, neither can I. Of course, I don't ever go to the spa except to pick up that main conditioner you like.
Pinkie set the flour down on the counter, cocked an eyebrow at him, and asked,
What were we trying to figure out here?
Her fiancé puffed out his cheeks and let out a heavy sigh.
I forget.
She let out a giggle punctuated by a snort and shook her head.
You're adorable. Promise me you won't forget the way back from Sweet Apple Acres?
He rolled his eyes.
I won't. Jeez, I only worked there for like 5 years.
Pinkie nodded in satisfaction.
Good. When you get back, I'll have some fresh bread right out of the oven to go with some hot brewed bag of soup.
She gave him a wink. Caramel's knees buckled a little as he flushed a bright red across his cheeks. He shook his head and assumed a look of exaggerated resolve.
Well, with that kind of reward waiting for me, I'd better set out on my mission. Dare the dark and the rain and the wind to deliver 1 box of pepper noogie.
The steely glint in his eye kind of went out of focus as he turned to the busily baking mare of his fancy.
What are these things called again?
She giggled.
Pepinelsa. They're my mama's favorite type of cookie, so I thought they'd be good for Mama to be.
Pinkie replied matter-of-factly.
Although my mama might like them because they kind of look like little rocks, but you can't eat them.
Pinkie pursed her lips and gave him a solemn look.
Rocks were always kind of important to my family.
She resumed her breezy tone with a flick of her frizzy magenta mane.
I changed the recipe a little and put in oodles of pistachio because last time I went to visit Fluttershy, she said she had this totally intense craving for pistachios, which is something I can work with. I mean, more than the pickles or pimentos, although I suppose I could have done with some kind of savory bread with olives in it, and that would have been okay, but savory foods and me are kind of like dragons and bicycles.
Caramel could only blink at her.
Dragons and...
She continued without missing a beat.
Nothing to do with one another. Although if you gave Spike a tricycle, I bet he'd be as cute as all out. And we could race. I wonder if there's a place you can rent tricycles in Cantalon.
She turned and looked at Caramel as if expecting an answer. He felt a mild tick in his left eye. Finally, his hard-won instincts kicked in and he leapt for the last trailing thread of the conversation he could reach.
Okay. Pfeffermoose. Got it. On my way.
She smiled at him as she turned, pausing before she wrapped her mouth around the handle of the sifter.
Hurry back and tell Mackie and the girls to say hi!
With that, she lifted the metal canister over the mixing bowl and began sifting its contents into it. Caramel nodded and turned to go, pausing at the door before trotting back to her side. He sidled up to her with a smile and leaned in to plant a kiss on her cheek.
Whoops. I almost forgot to do this.
The sides of her mouth curled up into a smile around the handle of the sifter as she gave him a sidelong glance with a flutter of her eyelashes. Suddenly, her blue eyes went wide as a violent shudder shook her along the length of her body from nose to tail, lifting her hooves off the floor in a staccato cadence and sending a mushroom cloud of flour out of the sifter and into the air over the two ponies' heads. When his fiancée's shaking just as abruptly stopped, Caramel let out a strained cough and blinked the powder out of his eyes. Pinkie's face and forelock were completely white, and an expression of shock and incredulity played across her features as the sifter dropped out of her mouth and into the bowl with a clank, throwing up a softer puff of flour. Her voice came low and soft, causing eddies in the cloud of ingredients that enveloped them.
A doozy!
She turned and grabbed Caramel by his cheeks with both hooves, pulling his gaze to hers.
A doozy!
The stallion stuttered out a reply as the violent shaking overtook her again.
What?
His head kept bobbing up and down as she released it and clumped her hooves back on the floorboards, her ears perked and her nose raised as if she was following a scent in the air. The rattling of her hooves stopped as she went still again, more flour billowing in the air around her. Just as Caramel got his head to stop nodding, she turned to him and locked eyes.
Sweet Applejackers! It's at Fluttershy!
A huge gasp escaped her as she leapt bodily into the air, each hoof spinning in a different direction. She pivoted in mid-leap and rocketed toward the back door, sending it open with a crash as she hurtled through it. She paused a moment and leapt into Caramel's forgotten galoshes, sending gouts of water in all directions as her hooves drove down into them with a splat, and then tore off into the rainy night. Caramel stared out the door after her, his jaw hanging loose, listening as the rapid squishy patter of her hooves receded. He shook his head, sending another burst of flour into the air, turned and grasped the hook of the umbrella in his teeth. He charged out after her, calling her name.
Quirky!
A moment later he came back, sheepishly closed the door and locked it, and then took off running again, the umbrella wildly thrashing over his head as he picked up his bright pink-clad hooves. Rarity's employees at the Carousel Boutique had just finished drawing the blinds and hanging the closed sign in the window when they heard the gentle tapping of their boss's hooves on the polished floor to draw their attention. A brisk smile crossed her alabaster face as her red-rimmed glasses settled onto her nose.
Well done, darlings! Now that you've finished, I'd like to take a few moments to discuss all the orders for the GGG, as well as give you an overview of this year's fall collection.
She turned and summoned a corkboard festooned with drawings and fabric swatches from the back room with the glittering magic from her horn.
I'll be returning to Canterlot tomorrow to oversee the work at the Bijou personally, so you'll be on your own until I return for the Summer Sun celebration.
At this, her two assistants, Snips, the apprentice tailor, and Thimble, the seamstress, exchanged a concerned glance. Rarity usually preferred to keep a tight rein on the gala dresses her boutique produced. She let out a small sigh.
Oh, I do so wish I could stay a bit longer in Ponyville, but that's how it is, I suppose.
She caught herself and gave them a warm smile.
Not that I don't trust you, darlings, to do an excellent job while I'm away. I have an absolute faith in the both of you.
Her employees both returned her smile with a grateful nod, beaming discreetly at the compliment. A wistful look crossed Rarity's porcelain-toned face as she resumed her speech.
It's just I hope to be here for.
She shook aside her reverie and drew herself up, assuming a business-like expression as she turned to the board and focused on a spot of glittering magic from the tip of her horn on one of the drawings, causing it to light up slightly.
Well, enough wool gathering, as it were. Let's get down to it, shall we? The overall theme I'm going to be exploring for the fall collection is...
She cut off abruptly as the door to the boutique slammed open. All three unicorns turned as one to see a vibrant pink pony frantically jogging in place in oversized galoshes, each hoofful sending a burst of rainwater out the top of each boot and onto the growing puddle of muddy water on the meticulously cleaned floor. Her face was matted and streaked with pallid white, and her mane hung straight in heavy, dripping sheets, framing a pair of wildly glazed blue eyes. She stopped dancing in place and planted her hooves, suddenly overtaken by a vibrating shudder that sent a cloud of water droplets into the air around her, splashing into an organza ball gown that stood in an alcove next to her. Rarity's hoof went to her mouth with a gasp of shock, but the crazed mare in the door abruptly stopped shaking and started rapidly jogging in place again, letting loose a barrage of rapid-fire speech in a rising crescendo.
Fluttershy, Rarity, Fluttershy, Mary, Applejack, it's happening now, it's a double super duper juicy. What are we taking a minute for? I gotta go, on!
Her frantic prancing swiveled her away from the three dumbfounded unicorns, and just as suddenly as she'd appeared, she accelerated back out the door, splitting the puddle she'd made into a V-shaped wave, splashing more muddy water on the delicate dresses to either side of the entry. Rarity's employees' heads swiveled to face her as she stood boggling, mouthing the torrent of words to herself with her ears laid back in concentration. She blinked, then her eyes went wide as well.
Fluttershy, now! Is something wrong? Your mane is never like that unless something is wrong!
The white unicorn's horns sparked to life and wrenched her glasses off, tossing them carelessly aside as she bolted for the door, rushing pell-mell into the downpour.
Pinkie, wait for me!
Snips floated his employer's spectacles from where his magic had caught them in midair and folded them carefully before slipping them into a small hidden pocket behind the lapel of his vest. Then he turned toward the door, willing it shut with a flick of his horn. Thimble gave him a sidelong look.
Could you make any sense of that?
The chubby blue-green unicorn stallion sauntered over to the mess by the door, giving it a quick glance over before he turned and headed for the back room. He gave the seamstress a genteel smile.
I've got some educated guesses, Miss Thimble, but only because I've lived here all my life and am acquainted with Miss Rarity's friends. I'm going to get on the horn to the girls at the Bijou. If what I think is happening, then the grapevine needs to start shaking, as it were. If you'll be so kind as to see to the stock up front, I'll be back in a moment with the mop.
With a short bow to the older mare, he glided out of the room as Thimble tentatively stepped forward to examine the mud-spattered organza gowns. She leapt back with a shriek as the door slammed open, narrowly missing her flank and revealing the waterlogged form of a tan stallion draped in a dark green rain slicker with muddy, bright magenta galoshes squeaking on his hooves. He spat at the handle of his umbrella, allowing the canopy to rest on his sodden head.
Did a bright pink mare just pass by?
The seamstress pointed a shaking hoof past him into the night and rain-shrouded town square.
She went that-a-way.
He nodded to her and gripped the umbrella handle in his teeth again.
Thanks.
With that, he turned and galloped away, the umbrella flipping inside out with a pop as he trailed it behind him. Thimble numbly nudged the door closed with her horn. She shook her head to clear it as she turned her attention to the gowns again. Another slam, another shriek, this time accompanied by a prodigious leap backward on the beige unicorn mare's part that sent her crashing into a rack of sundresses. The tan stallion in the pink boots was back, panting with his teeth clenched on the inverted umbrella, an earnest but glazed look on his face.
Sorry what's startling you there.
With an apologetic little half-bow, he turned and galloped away again. Thimble climbed shakily to her hooves and closed the door, and then began shoving ponykins and display cases against it with her magic. A full-throated argument was in strident swing in the muddy courtyard of Sweet Apple Acres' main compound as the apple trees lashed and rustled in the wind and rain on the farm's rolling hills. The Apple family's latest farm dog, Naomi, skittered back and forth across the front porch of the farmhouse, barking frantically and wagging her tail in unalloyed canine excitement, largely ignored by the assembly of equines. On one side stood a mud-spattered white earth pony mare draped in an orange rain poncho marked with the crest of Equestrian Emergency Services, water rolling down her sodden nurse's cap and pink mane as she glared at a furious female zebra clad in a dripping dark cloak, gold rings adorning her neck and ankles as she hiked her bristling black and white tail in agitation. Off to the side of the argument's ground zero, two Earth Pony sisters stood watching with a mixture of dismay, annoyance, and worry on their faces. Both mares were bundled up in raincoats and galoshes, shiny with water and flecked with mud from running. The orange elder sister stood hitched up to a shiny little surrey with some fringe on the top. Her waterlogged old cow pony hat flopped down in her eyes, with a long blonde ponytail trailing beneath that lay flattened to her neck and dripping down her muscular shoulders. The younger sister was a leggy, light yellow filly, just on the cusp between adolescence and marehood, with an apple-red mane tied back out of her eyes by a pink bandana. Her flanks bore a cutie mark depicting a hammer superimposed over the face of a half-apple. A sneer crossed the striped equine's dark muzzle. The white pony scowled back at her, grinding her hooves in the muddy ground.
Miss Fluttershy needs a real doctor looking after her, not a witch doctor!
At this, the red-headed filly stamped a hoof.
Hey, that ain't very nice to say at all, Nurse Redheart.
The black and white striped mare's eyes narrowed dangerously as she advanced on the Ponyville nurse. Applejack shifted nervously in her harness.
Now, just hang on there, Zecora. Don't let's go all half-cocked now. If we can just calm down and talk this through a reasonable type fashion.
She was cut off as Pinkie Pie skidded to a stop beside them, throwing a wave of mud ahead of her that splattered onto the blonde pony and the nurse. After a brief moment of blinking her wide blue eyes at the assembled mares, she started vibrating in place like a pastel-pink, mud-dipped, four-legged jackhammer.
Applejack, is Fluttershy okay?
The farm mare hung her head and brought a hoof up to her brow with a splat.
Oh, good day in the morning. I knew it was only a matter of time.
She looked up at the shimmying, bouncing pink mare, ignoring the mud dripping down on her own forehead onto her freckled cheek.
Fluttershy's just gone into labor, Pinkie. I went and got Nurse Redheart, but then some pony.
She emphasized her words with a glare directed at her younger sister.
Figured it'd be a good idea to run and get Zecora when I distinctly told her to stay put and mind her sister-in-law.
The younger mare set her jaw and pushed out her lower lip in a classic Little Sisters "you're not the boss of me" expression.
It is a good idea. Zecora knows all kinds of herbal remedies and such like.
At this, Nurse Redheart cut in, her glare still fixed on the zebra.
Which is all very nice if you want to brew tea. You'll excuse me if I prefer modern medical technology for delivering a foal.
The zebra braced her back legs, standing on the tips of her hooves as she snarled at her adversary.
The mother's in no danger, nor the foal in her womb. Why take her from home and put her in a sterile white room?
The white pony lashed her pink tail.
Exactly! It's sterile, not a filthy backwoods farmhouse!
Applejack looked sharply at the nurse from under her drooping hat.
Whoa now, just what the hell are you saying there, Redheart?
The nurse ignored her and glared at the zebra's scowling face.
And if something does go wrong, we can deal with it right away before things turn grave. Now get out of my face and go back to your cave!
She paused, blinking in the dim light coming from the nearby front porch, before scowling to herself through gritted teeth.
Oh, by Celestia's sun-dappled rump, now you got me doing it!
Zecora snorted and surged forward, her forehead pressing up against Nurse Redheart's as they locked flaring eyes.
I don't live in a cave. I live in a hut. I am this close to kicking your skinny, white butt.
The medical pony ground her teeth and pushed back just as hard.
Bring it on, Candy Striper!
The torrential rain seemed to intensify as both mares started pushing and shoving her back and forth and shouting in a raucous mix of ponies and zebraic, with Applebloom tugging at her zebra friend's tail to try and pull her back as Applejack struggled to work her way free of her surrey's harness and intervene before it escalated further. Pinkie Pie continued to bounce and jitter in place like a dismayed pink wind-up toy. Naomi leapt off the porch and started running in circles around the whole scene, yapping and jumping, and apparently having the grandest time a hyperactive canine could imagine. It was at the height of this tumult that Rarity staggered into the farm's courtyard, her once pristine coat slicked down to her skin and splattered with several varieties of mud, her soaked, bedraggled mane and tail bearing a payload of twigs and leaves, indicating she'd taken some tumbles through a couple of hedges in her headlong flight. By the look of the lily pad speared on her horn, she may have fallen into a pond as well. A few hoof steps on her heels, a raggedly panting Caramel gamely tried to keep pace with her, attempting in vain to keep the upturned umbrella clenched in his teeth over her already drenched head. The dishevelled unicorn came to a tottering stop next to the shimmying form of Pinkie, barely keeping on her hooves as she heaved and gasped to catch her breath, while the tan stallion who'd been following her dithered between sheltering her or his erstwhile fiancé. Rarity's deep blue eyes widened as she took in the scene before her, and she began to scream, as much to the world around her as to any one pony, her normally well-mannered voice cracking in the throes of hysterics as she danced from hoof to hoof.
What is going on? What happened to Fluttershy? I'm wet and hysterical and everybody's yelling and putting out and nothing makes sense!
Applejack sat heavily down in the mud with a shuddering sigh, half out of her harness and rocking in place with her hooves over her eyes, a worsening headache pounding in her skull like the rain on her hat. Meanwhile, Applebloom was struggling to interpose herself between Zecora and Redheart's shoving match. Unable to choose between the two pathetic mares on either side of him, Caramel tossed the umbrella away in despair and slouched despondently between his vibrating, shimmering fiancé to his right and the wailing, mud-drenched unicorn on his left. Naomi broke out of her circular track and rushed to confront and loudly denounce the discarded umbrella, focusing her full barking fury on it as if it were the most villainous thing in Equestria. A piercing whistle echoed across the barnyard, bringing everything to a sudden, startled stop. Naomi instantly deflated and slunk away under the porch, looking abject and guilty in a way only dogs can manage. All eyes turned to behold the impossibly wizened form of Granny Smith, standing there, framed in the golden glow of the doorway, looking at them all. Cold steel gleamed in her eyes, while the wind played at her wispy white mane and fluttered the heavy shawl around her bony shoulders. The aged green mare lowered her hoof from her lips and set it down with only the slightest tremor on the planks of the farmhouse porch. She screwed her wrinkled muzzle into a scowl. To a mare, the younger ponies all turned to face her and hung their heads, fidgeting uncomfortably under the relentless gaze as she glared at them. Before any of the chastised ponies could respond, the Apple family matriarch looked up towards Sweet Apple Acre's front gate with a grin spreading across her wrinkled face as a cheery voice sounded over the muddy courtyard.
Sorry if the weather slowed me up a little getting here.
All eyes turned to see a stout mare draped in a heavy canvas cloak and broad-brimmed hat pick her way across the churned-up mud of the courtyard, bulging saddlebags hanging from her sides. When she stepped into the light, she revealed a broad, olive-green face with a bluff, open smile. Granny Smith held up a hoof in welcome.
Just the guy I was waiting for. Howdy, Cabbage. You got me note, I reckon?
The sturdy mare nodded.
That I did, Granny.
Nurse Redheart blinked in recognition and stammered,
Cabbage Leaf? The midwife?
The new arrival nodded again.
Right-a-rooney.
She squinted her eyes and peered at the flustered nurse from under the floppy brim of her hat.
You're one of the Hart sisters, ain't you? I heard tell y'all went into medicine.
She beamed at the younger mare.
Does my old heart proud to see Phyllis I delivered make good like that. Feels like I'm making a difference.
The Apple family matriarch nodded in satisfaction and turned toward the door, gesturing at it with a hoof. With that, she clumped up the stairs, slipping off her muddy boots, and went inside. Granny Smith turned back to the zebra, stallion, and assembly of mares huddled in the rain. She snapped a hoof at Redheart and Zecora.
You and you, go get washed up too. You'll be helping Cabby out, Miss Fluttershy. Step lively now.
The zebra nodded and started in toward the house, pausing and turning to look back at Nurse Redheart.
I am sorry to say I let my collar get hot. That I said harsh words. That you and I fought.
Nurse Redheart fidgeted and took a glance over her shoulder in the direction of Ponyville.
Yes, you're probably right. But proper procedures in this case.
Proper procedures is what I say they is, as long as your hooves are on Apple family land, Missy. Either play on your team or get the hell off our property.
Granny Smith set her jaw and gazed sternly at the younger mare. The white mare nodded in acquiescence and fell into step behind Zecora. When they passed into the house, she came up beside the zebra herbalist and leaned in, whispering with a contrite expression on her face. They stopped and traded hoof shakes that turned into a brief hug, and then continued back toward the first-floor bathroom. The wizened mare turned to her granddaughters, focusing on the eldest, still partially tangled in the harness of the surrey.
AJ, put that contraption back in the shed and go inside and get cleaned up. You're in charge for the duration.
She turned to the younger sister and bobbed her head toward the bedraggled trio of Rarity, Caramel, and Pinkie Pie.
Apple Bloom, take them poor girls upstairs and get them settled in a warm bath, for they catch their death of cold.
Without another word, the Apple sisters hurried to comply. Applejack struggled back into a harness and fought the not-so-shiny-now surrey into position to roll it back into the shed. Caramel stepped aside while Apple Bloom threw a foreleg over Rarity's shoulders and clamped her teeth onto Pinkie's tail. Granny Smith nodded in satisfaction, and then turned and cracked a toothless smile at the slightly befuddled-looking tan stallion, who now stood in the deserted courtyard in his mud-clotted pink boots, the wind whipping his rain slicker as a dejected, broken umbrella flapped in the mud behind him. She beckoned to him with her hoof.
Now as for you, young feller, you look like you could use some coffee and pie.
A smile blossomed across Caramel's face as he stepped up onto the porch, pausing as he pulled the slightly rumpled box forth from under the cape of his rain slicker. He beamed as it dangled by its string from his teeth.
Thanks, man. Pinkie and I brought Piffin Noodle, too.
The old grey mare chuckled as she went inside.
Well, that's right nice of you, sonny. Leave your girls' galoshes out on the porch so you don't tread mud all over.
Fluttershy let out a small, strangled mew as another contraction coursed through her. She lay sprawled on an old quilt atop the bed, her wings hanging limply at her rounded sides as she let out a succession of ragged, panting breaths. Seated on the floor beside the butter-coloured Pegasus, her mountain of a husband, Big Macintosh, looked gravely down at his shivering little wife and gently stroked her back with a broad hoof. His low, gentle voice hung in the air against the backdrop of rain pattering against the shuttered windows.
All right, keep breathing, little wing. Nice and steady now, just like they taught us in Lamai's class.
Her faint voice replied plaintively.
Oh, I'm sorry, Big Bunny. It's okay. Really, that last one wasn't really that bad.
The huge red earth pony pursed his lips and furrowed his brow. He'd been married to the soft-spoken Pegasus for long enough to know when she was trying her best to downplay how bad things were. Big Macintosh was strong enough to buck oak trees in half, but he couldn't do anything to ease his beloved Fluttershy's suffering at that moment. Nothing except stand firm at her side, offering her his quiet support. Both ponies looked up as the door to their bedroom softly opened to reveal a stocky green mare with a white-streaked brown mane and tail and a head of Cabbage for a cutie mark. She grinned at them cheerfully as she set a pair of saddlebags down beside her. Fluttershy furtively peeked out from behind her straggling pink mane, biting her lip as she gingerly raised one of her hooves a little. She was cut off with a squeak as another contraction hit. Big Macintosh nuzzled her neck as she gritted her teeth and curled her hooves into an old quilt beneath her. He looked back up at the stout midwife as she came into the room. The stocky mare chuckled as she settled down beside him. She gave him a sidelong grin and nudged him in the side. Cabbage Leaf ran a hoof down Fluttershy's side. At the sound of shuffling hooffalls at the door, she turned and beckoned to Zecora and Nurse Redheart, who waited expectantly outside.